the agenda today, we're going to start with why. We won't spend too much time on that as we want to leave plenty of time for the actual governance discussion. But I think it's important for all of us to understand why citizen development is gaining traction, where customers are coming from when they begin to consider citizen development. Now, there could be different motivators, and understanding which one specifically motivates your customer will help you guide them better in structuring the program, in considering the right things. And then we'll talk about the profile of a successful citizen developer. I don't see we have a lot of documentation on this yet, but customers ask this. As you can imagine, having the right people is critical to the success of the program. So it's important to know what does a good citizen developer look like and who should become one. And then we'll also talk briefly on training paths. And then we'll talk in depth on governance considerations. We'll get into the capabilities we have today to address customers' governance concerns, what questions are commonly asked by them, how our platform satisfies those requirements specifically, what are the gaps, what's on our roadmap. So I hope this will prepare you to have the governance discussion with your customers and prepare you for the questions that may come your way. And finally, we'll wrap with a brief touch on StudioX Differentiators. There are really two angles to look at this when I think about differentiators. What I meant is two common questions I've gotten from customers are, when should developers use StudioX versus Studio? Customers are looking for guidance on the difference in capabilities between the two development platforms that look very similar. And to best answer this is actually not just a question on differences in features, but also in other factors like user profile and workflow automation characteristics. So we'll go over a bit how you can provide guidance to your customers on that. The second angle is competitive differentiators, especially from prospects. When we're pitching StudioX to them, I've gotten questions on how it's different from Microsoft's Power Automate, and if customer is already a Microsoft shop, like why would they not just use that? So I'll give you some key takeaways on the competitive differentiators. Because we have a full hour of material to cover, if you have a question, please put it in the chat window and we'll get to it all at the very end. I just want to make sure we have enough time to cover everything. So why are companies considering citizen development? What we've seen is, for some, the goal is to enable the workforce to have the ability to automate, to train up as many citizen developers as possible, and to have that automation culture grow in the company. But for some others, the goal is not necessarily to enable all the employees, but to identify a few good candidates and train them to be citizen developers to augment the existing dev team and to develop the low-hanging fruits that the core dev team won't get to. And then for some, the sole goal is to be able to find that one killer use case that will save billions. And the whole goal is not to generate a huge pipeline or train a huge number of developers, but just to use it as a way to evangelize automation to the business so that the one killer use case will get identified. Because the citizen development program enables those closest to business processes who are best positioned to provide solutions. In this case, the purpose is to look for an automation that many people will consume. So as you can imagine, understanding why the company wants to do it is good information to have. It will help you give better guidance because, for example, wanting many people to be consumers of automations is a bit different from wanting many people to be developers of automations. You probably have seen this graph before. There are typically a large number of tasks that individually don't necessarily have high returns to justify having a COE developer or partner to develop, but yet make up a high percentage of automation opportunities. And in this case, citizen developers can fill this gap and can augment the COE existing dev team in going after these low-hanging fruits, one of the possible motivators we just talked about. For these employee-driven ideas, your workforce chooses tasks to automate based on their individual needs, and collectively, long-tail tasks provide a high percentage of automation opportunities, while the rock in your COE focuses on those highly complex, high-return, enterprise-level automation opportunities. So I've adapted some of the following slides from business consulting from the ConocoPhillips Citizen Development Program kickoff, but that was January. So I've made some updates to capture the recent changes and new features in our product, especially StudioX, as well as added a few slides to address questions I've collected from customers and partners in the last few months. So here we go. In a typical citizen development program, we have the COE developers, the citizen developers, and the users or consumers of automations. And together they form this broad user base that drives ideas to transform the enterprise. In each layer of this pyramid, you get each of these groups serving a particular purpose and the respective UiPath tools that are best fit for that group to serve that purpose. So COE developers use Studio to build enterprise transforming automations, while citizen developers use StudioX and sometimes Studio to build automations for themselves and for their teams. And the users or consumers can leverage Automation Hub and attendant bots to ideate and test and consume. The citizen model has three types of personas with specific training and execution characteristics. Whenever someone has an automation idea, the first question is, who do you want to build a bot for? And that determines whether that person is a self-user, power user, or a consumer. Self-users are automating for themselves. They need training for low to medium development skills. They would use StudioX. Power users are automating for themselves and their peers. They need training for medium to advanced development skills. In terms of product, Studio should be an option for them, and they should not be restricted to StudioX. And then for consumers, they're not developing. They just need to be trained on how to work alongside a bot, how to start a process from the robot tray. They do not need access to Studio or StudioX. What they need is the UiPath assistant. So let's talk briefly about the consumers. All of us here should have the UiPath assistant on our laptops as part of our internal COE's work on the Robot for Every Employee program. These automations are fed to us. We don't need to do anything. We don't even need to install this. It was pushed out to me one day when I woke up, and I have access to automations that the COE has selected for me based on my role, and I can just click run if I want to use any of them on demand. So from the governance perspective, the COE has full control over who gets what will be deployed to who, and when I use something on here, logs will be sent to the orchestrator reporting my usage. As a consumer, there's not really any possibility of me doing anything destructive to the company by running these pre-built automations that meet the company's policy requirements and not developed by the consumers. So let's move on to the next layer up the pyramid, the citizen developers. Before we get into governance for citizen developers, a commonly asked question I got is, what does the profile of a successful citizen developer look like? Companies who are looking to citizen developers to augment their existing dev team are particularly interested in identifying good candidates of citizen developers because they wouldn't be just picking anyone. So let's look at the criteria. Business user eager to automate manual and tedious tasks, enjoys learning new technology. They should have basic analytical thinking and a basic understanding of formulas. They can break a process down into smaller logical units. They can draw a basic process diagram, like nothing too complex or involved, just a basic process diagram. They should be proficient in Excel. They can use functionalities like pivot tables, complex formulas, VLOOKUP, can use macros but not necessarily write macros, for example. Programming knowledge not required. So in terms of training, we have customers who enforce that their citizen developers have completed the required training before getting access to the software. And this is good because as much as StudioX is designed for business users without programming knowledge, it's not like Microsoft Word or Excel where you can just pick up and start using. There's a learning curve, even if it's user-friendly. We've seen business users getting frustrated with StudioX, the beta version, because they didn't go through any training and then couldn't do what they wanted to do. So enforcing training will lead to a better user experience. The the training path I recommended to ConocoPhillips and other customers is the short StudioX intro video, 6 minutes long, and then the Academy StudioX course, about 5 hours long, and RPA Starter, which can be optional because the StudioX course also covers a bit of RPA overview. And then there's a really good page with a list of additional StudioX tutorials that cover common use cases. So if people want more practice, that's a good place to do that. So when ConocoPhillips started, we didn't have a lot of content or official recommendation on training paths, but now we do. And here's what it looks like. Actually, this is still a work in progress. The first draft was just published by Anna Chinka a couple of days ago on Confluence, fresh off the press. I'll share the link later, but this is a good starting point and reference to guide your customer. It shows what skills are required for each of the 3 personas we talked about and recommended trainings for best outcomes. So going back to the profile of a good citizen developer, I just want to give you another perspective of the citizen developer represented by numbers, as well as some benefits citizen developers have found. Based on some survey results, 50% of all people describe citizen developers as problem solver. So think about the problem solver in your circles, the problem solver in the people you know, like those would probably make good citizen developers. Other highly ranked descriptors are creative, hardworking, organized, leader. 34% of citizen developers play a supervisory role in the company, and the majority are savvy computer users with no formal background in computer science or software engineering. 48% of citizen developers cited increased satisfaction at work. 42% found that the citizen development practice increased their confidence. 29% received more recognition in the company. 26% felt increased motivation at work. 82% witnessed reduction in inefficient tasks. 71% reported increase in team productivity. 60% made apps to reduce data entry. And 71% built their first app in less than 3 months, from ideation to design to delivery. And this is not just for RPA, it's for citizen developers in general. So it's RPA, it's probably even less than 3 months. So I thought these are very interesting and compelling numbers. Citizen-led automation is governed based on solution characteristics and monitored by the COE to identify ideas with enterprise-wide impact. There are 2 types of citizen-led automations with different characteristics. On the left, we have those that people build for themselves, for self-use only. Solution characteristics are individual usage and required current access right. We'll go into more details on access and governance in later slides, but high level here, the code would go through self-testing and maybe automated testing set up by the COE through Workflow Analyzer. And obviously, impact will be low as it'd be for that one user only. Moving towards the right, we have citizen-led automations with medium complexity. It may be for a team to use instead of one person, require external access rights because multiple people might be using it. It should also go through more stringent code review, COE level code review, and access management. Impact will be higher than the self-use case because multiple teams, multiple departments could be using it. And then on the far right is the COE-led automations. I'm just showing it here for comparison purpose, but as part of this presentation, we'll focus on citizen development. Let's now dive deeper into the governance considerations. So UiPath has built a very strong citizen development platform. And in my mind, what makes the citizen development platform strong is not just the ease of development, but also the controls we have in place to mitigate risk. These controls satisfy needs in preventive, predictive, corrective, and reporting categories. For many of these points, we'll dive deeper in future slides, but I want to first give you an overview. But before we get into these controls, I just want to prefix by saying while we can provide best effort tools that guide employees to follow organizational governance policies, in many cases, there will be ways to bypass these governance policies. So then what's the point in building governance capabilities, you asked? Well, there's a multi-part answer to this on Confluence, but the short answer is sometimes people accidentally violate rules if the tools provide no checks or guidance to help people stay within guidance. So a big part of governance is not just to prevent the malicious attempts, but to prevent the unintended accidental mistakes. It's very easy for an employee who wants to be 100% compliant to accidentally do something that's non-compliant. So governance capabilities ensure that people who want to do the right thing are doing the right thing. On the other hand, if an employee is looking to actively violate governance policies, the company probably has bigger issues with that employee than what they're doing in their automations. So in terms of expected code of conduct and ethics, bot usage is held accountable at the same level as human usage. Citizen developers, in particular self-users, are expected to develop low-risk solutions for self-use only. So having said that, let's get into what controls we have in place. For preventive controls, StudioX has built-in templates that citizen developers can use for common use cases as a starting point. The COE can also create additional citizen workflow templates to guide best coding practice and allow monitoring and logging more effectively so that the citizen developer wouldn't have to start from scratch. And then behavioral control through policy file. I have a whole slide dedicated to the policy file later, but in short, it helps as a preventive control because it can govern package feeds, StudioX settings, and workflow analyzer rule settings. And the workflow analyzer rules, some come out of the box and additional custom ones can be added. These rules can help control quality and automation behavior. And then self-user credentials. I have a separate slide on access later, but in short, the use of self-user credentials helps enforce current access privileges, which also serves as a preventive control to mitigate risks. And then for predictive controls, again, the automatic code review can help identify malicious attempts. For example, if the company has specific patterns they want to prevent, they could write a custom workflow analyzer rule to detect obvious misuse patterns and flag these as errors using the built-in governance support. Then when citizen developers hit it during the enforced automatic code review as part of the run or publish process, the flags can be logged and COE can be notified. And since the workflow analyzer custom rules are just a .NET class library, they can implement anything they want in the custom layer and could add any logic they wanted to the rule to log the information or send a notification, for example. And then for corrective controls, a couple ideas here. We recommend customers keep a repository of lessons learned from incidents and add them to their training and guidelines so that citizen developers can reference them and not repeat past mistakes. Another idea is use orchestrator logs to build automated reports on the behavior and success patterns of citizen developers. So for example, it will be possible to see how often citizen developers are running processes and if those processes are executing successfully or regularly running into errors. This will enable the COE to reach out and help and work with users that appear to be struggling to get their automations working. And then for reporting and auditing, StudioX activities log important actions by default to robot logs. Basically, StudioX can record what applications and URLs users are working with and extracting data from, what Excel and Word files they're working with, when they automate email with Outlook, and when they send emails using an automated process. In 20.4, this information is emitted into the logs and will give organizations the ability to see who's running automation process, what they're doing, and if they're being successful, errors are automatically logged. In 20.10, there are plans to expand the reporting capabilities, including information about what the user is doing at design time in StudioX instead of just at runtime, as it currently is. And then besides robot logs, there's the usage report that allows for auditing at various levels, and license management report to allow deactivation. As you can see, a lot of controls in place to mitigate risks. So we've covered the self-users. Let's talk about power users. Power users follow traditional SDLC governance and controls as the solutions they develop are deployed to other users. So then there are additional controls to mitigate risk, including separate environments for dev, test, prod as best practice. For access, separate logins and additional access rights may be needed depending on the automations. And then for training, power users should definitely go through more training than self-users. I showed the recommended training paths earlier. And finally, we recommend partitioning the orchestrator for managing the access rights of power users, and modern folders can be used for granularity. I've seen recommendations for customers to use a completely separate orchestrator to manage system developers, but that has been a hard sell for ConocoPhillips, at least because of the cost of the separate orchestrator. Plus, they can just segregate by tenants, and with the availability of modern folders now, a lot of granular control can be done using the folders. So I've dedicated a slide on the new governance file feature in 20.4, as I believe it really makes our governance capabilities much stronger and more robust, and addresses some common governance concerns that our customers often have over the citizen development model. So to give you some highlights, what the new governance file feature is able to do is the following. It uses the registry to point to a remote policy file that the machine has read-only access to. This means that the machine will read the policy, but the users can't modify it or disable the policy, assuming they don't have permissions to change the registry key, which is fairly standard in the enterprise IT world. To ensure quality and compliance, customers always want to make sure citizen developers are creating quality workflows that are fully compliant with company policies, and the workflow analyzer can help with that. 20.4 StudioX ships with rules designed for governance purpose specifically, including package restrictions. Package restrictions enable blocking specific unwanted packages. A lot of times, non-compliant activity use is a big concern. The ability to specify which feeds packages can be installed from will address many of these concerns, since citizen developers will only see approved packages in their package manager. Also, the ability to specify feeds is a prerequisite for delivering required custom workflow analyzer rules. And then secondly, activity restrictions, which enable prohibiting specific blacklisted activities or allowing only specific whitelisted activities. It's also possible to write a custom rule that checks timing values of activities and errors if they're not within what the company considers to be an acceptable range. And then third, application and URL restrictions, which enable prohibiting citizen developers from automating certain applications like SAP, for example, which could have a tremendous detrimental impact if misused, or automating against certain websites like Facebook, for example, which the company may not find any business value from automating. So there's control in deciding which applications and URLs are restricted and system developers can have access to. And the policy can require citizen developers to pass all specified workflow analyzer rules in order to run or publish, which means any errors would block running or publishing non-compliant projects. Also, the policy configuration file gives us the ability to define different policies for Studio and StudioX users. So we can choose different policies for our RPA developers in Studio, since they're generally doing different things from citizen developers. So for example, it's possible to give them access to UiPath's Connect feed and other feeds, and give them the ability to enable and disable packages as they need, but not give them ability to add additional feeds. We can also set the policy to require checking in any changes to source code prior to publishing for those RPA developers who work with source control. So in short, this governance file feature gives us a lot of control over what we allow citizen developers and RPA developers to do and what we want to restrict them from doing. Just to note that while this feature is a great enhancement to governance, I've had customers asking for further enhancement to be able to deploy through the orchestrator, which is not a current capability yet. So in case you get asked by your customers too, the reason for the ask is there's a pain point with mass deployment of workflow analyzer rules and updates to rules. And the pain point is if the COE makes changes to the rule set, add any new custom rules, change existing rules, what they do now is upload and deploy a separate DLL to do that, which is a security concern because a separate DLL dangling is actually a lot like a virus. So while the policy file doesn't have to be on the user's machine, the custom rule libraries must be deployed to each machine for Studio to find them. So I spoke with Andrew Hall on this, and there are plans to fix this, and it's on the roadmap for 20.10. So just want you to know in case this comes up in your discussion with customers. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I highly recommend checking out the governance demo page of StudioX. Andrew has an 11-minute video on there that's really helpful and would address many customer questions. And there's a file-based governance MVP page that documents the business benefits and the features details very well, as well as some of these other pages here are all fantastic resources I'd recommend reading over before having a discussion with your customers. Most of these are internal, except for the last one, which is the customer-facing page on governance in 20.4. But as you can imagine, the orchestrator plays an important role in a UiPath citizen development program, similar to the role it plays in any other enterprise RPA programs that are not citizen development. The orchestrator lets you manage creation, monitoring, and deployment, empowering you to govern your entire robot fleet. It serves as a central control hub for the automations, and administrators are given a full view of citizen developer activities through the orchestrator. So a lot of these orchestrator functionalities listed here are not specific to citizen development, but are features that are especially important for citizen development governance. For example, license allocation and usage. Companies like ConocoPhillips want to have a way of monitoring who have not used their licenses at all so that they can redelegate to other potential citizen developers. And being able to segregate developers into their own individual environments and operating units, that has been important as well. Real-time monitoring, all these metrics and logs that the orchestrator collects to help the COE keep an eye on the robots, queues, jobs. Not only that, but individualized monitoring so that administrators can just double-click into individual developers to view user job results, error feeds, logs, and transactions. And lastly, a complete audit trail tracking user actions on orchestrator components, such as asset creation, machine deployment, user creation, etc. So all of these help provide companies with controls in place to make sure their citizen development program will not become the next Frankenstein project. So because the orchestrator plays such a central role in governing a citizen development program, companies should require citizen developers to activate UiPath through the orchestrator. During installation, all citizen developers should be automatically connecting their machine to the orchestrator without the choice of not to. Failure to connect to orchestrator should lock citizens from using StudioX, and the use of community edition should be disabled. Developed code must be published to the orchestrator to be run as a production process. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult for the COE to track citizen developers' activities. Here's a table that shows side by side how orchestrator access should be carefully managed to ensure appropriate controls. For example, consumers should only have access to trigger attended solution, should be monitored by orchestrator, should be auto-connected to the orchestrator, whereas self-users and power users would also have access to develop attended solution. COE user will have access to develop, execute unintended solutions, and COE administrators will have access to all the orchestrators in all environments. So different levels of access to different actions based on role. We briefly touched on developer segregation and modern folders earlier. You might have seen the slide from Jerry's knowledge sink on mass deployment earlier. If you haven't, I highly recommend going back to that recording as it's very informative. So I won't repeat that content here, but we'll just give a high-level overview. Orchestrator configuration should be designed to appropriately isolate data between subdivisions and between specific users. As the citizen automation model grows in scale, management of resources and isolation of data will become key factors to success. As you know, Orchestrator allows for this division using tenants, organization units, and folders. And with modern folders, you can get real granular and maintain fine-grained control over your automations and their entities and personnel across the entire organization. Modern folders allow for a set of automations to be managed separately, developer segregation, automatic provisioning. You can set custom roles, set roles per user, per folder, and subfolders inherit the role assignment of the parent. And while we're on the topic of folders, in 20.4, we're introducing the concept of personal folders. With this feature enabled, citizen developers will be able to publish their work to Orchestrator under a personal folder that is going to be visible in UiPath Assistant. This helps with further segregation and governance, as the COE developed processes would likely be going through a different level of controls than citizen developed processes. Monitoring and reporting, they're extremely important as they help ensure both visibility into the productivity of the bots as well as the immediate and appropriate handling of incidents when they come up. The orchestrator has oversight of all processes that are run, frequency and duration of the runs, status of each run, whether it's successful or if it failed, license capacity and usage. And we went over earlier that StudioX activities log important actions to robot logs by default, including application interactions, application name or URL, and browser type, data scraping from websites, resource use, Word or Excel file use, Outlook account use, sent mails. This list is expanding as our product team continues to work on making governance more robust. And here are some examples of control actions that administrators can take. For example, if a process is not behaving as expected or has consecutive fails, stop process in execution. If a process is not being used for over a year, remove the process. If StudioX license is not being used for over X number of months, revoke the license. If a system developer is abusing the software and or the automation program policies, revoke license. So monitoring and reporting can help guide the control actions and keep the program safe. So let's talk about access for a minute and the best practice there. The recommendation is whenever possible, especially prior to 20.4, have the attended bot request credentials at runtime without needing to store the credentials. Use single sign-on. When credentials are needed, use the self-user's existing Windows account. And when that's not available, prompt for credentials at runtime. For power users, similarly, use the user's existing Windows account or design the process to pull from Windows Credential Manager if needed. A third option is create credentials specifically for robots and store as orchestrator assets or prompt at runtime. Also, 20.4 introduces the get username password activity, and it's designed to ensure citizen developers can securely store and retrieve passwords. So make sure your customer is aware of the existence of these activities. So really, with this governance best practices, the attended bot should not have any more access than the user would have. So the security should not really be a concern there. And really, attended automation is no different than anything else in that nothing stops a user from having a password.txt file, for example, on their desktop for use outside of automation. And I mentioned previously, if the customer has specific patterns they want to prevent, they could also consider writing a custom workflow analyzer rule to detect obvious misuse patterns and flag those as errors using the built-in governance support. And I know there are plans in 20.10 to explore if we can introduce a built-in rule that catches some obvious bad password use patterns. For example, interacting with a password field and typing in a hard-coded value. But we'll never be able to catch 100% of misuse, as there are too many ways for users to do things that wouldn't trigger obvious patterns. So the best defense will always be to train users on how to do it right. So companies need to prepare for complexity and be able to anticipate them before starting a citizen development program. Here are some pointers, common questions to consider. We've actually discussed some of these in previous slides, so I won't read through all of this. The key takeaway here is think about how to scope and roll out the program to maximize its chance of success most quickly. And that involves planning the messaging, how you bring everyone along the journey, how you encourage participation, maybe through gamification or career progression, how you efficiently leverage enterprise and COE resources, and think about what extent of ownership does the COE want to have in running the program. For ConocoPhillips, for example, right now the COE controls all of it, but they want to get to a point where people can automate with minimal engagement from the COE, and that's how they want to message it to all the employees. They don't want people to think they would have to jump through hoops to get access to the software and have to let the COE check their work profusely before getting anything done or granting any approvals. They don't want to create that mindset in people. So when they plan the program, they want to make sure a lot of the governance can be automated, for example, and that participants can feel empowered and have a sense of ownership. The most number of questions I got from them during this whole program setup process were around workflow analyzer, automated code review, automatic deployment, and things like that. And they make sure that level 0 self-help is part of the support model, and that they publish plenty of material in their internal portal to educate and support their citizen developers. So these are things that should be considered as well, in addition to what technical capabilities are there in the product to enforce governance. Also, the messaging and internal marketing piece is important as well. One mistake companies can make is look at the UiPath products, StudioX, Assistant, and just assume that by simply making them available to their employees, people will just pick it up and start automating. The reality is people need motivation to change their behavior. Change is not easy, and there should be an intentional effort put in to drive that, especially in the beginning phase of the program. At ConocoPhillips, we recently did a virtual botathon, and people's excitement and engagement levels are visibly different before and after the event. Before the event, the COE rolled out the software to a bunch of citizen developers, with many just sitting there on people's laptops unactivated. After the botathon, people got really hyped up, and there's a lot more activity and more ideas coming. Now that people have seen what this can do and what kind of things can be automated so quickly and easily. Some of these were painful manual tasks. So this really gets people's wheels spinning and the engagement level up after they experience it firsthand. And with some initial guidance to ensure a positive experience, of course. And now ConocoPhillips is looking to run these virtual botathons every month. My last topic is StudioX Differentiators. Earlier, I mentioned the two angles to look at this. One is when should developers use StudioX versus Studio? Customers are looking for guidance on the difference in capabilities between the two products. What we've seen is it could be beneficial and sometimes more efficient to be able to switch between the two when needed. It's possible to do that as you can have a citizen developer create a workflow in StudioX and then maybe get stuck somewhere and hand the workflow to a COE developer to continue the work in Studio, resolve whatever roadblock, and then hand it back to the citizen developer to continue working on in StudioX, and it'll remain editable in StudioX. So because these are possibilities, the COE would want to know upfront what can StudioX do and what can it not do to help with capacity planning and development planning. The second angle is competitive differentiators between StudioX and Power Automate. So let's get into both of these angles a little bit. First, when to use StudioX versus Studio. I know Tim is preparing more material on this topic specifically, so I won't go too deep here. I'll just give a high-level overview. When customers ask for guidance on this, they're often focused on the feature differences between the two products, but really that shouldn't be the only factor that guides the decision. The three factors that should guide their decision in picking StudioX versus Studio are user profile, workflow automation characteristics, and features. User profile is the use of the software a business user or an RPA developer. Do they have coding skills, basic programming knowledge? Is the opportunity employee driven or COE driven? Workflow automation. Is the automation approach bottom up or top down? Automation target, how complex is the task to be automated? How many steps does it have? Is it just a sequence, or does it involve flowcharts and state machines? Are there multiple files in the project, or is it just a single file with a simple sequence? So the type of workflows, project size, file compatibility, and license type are all part of the workflow automation consideration. Features. I know this list is getting updated as the product team continues to improve StudioX, but this is a good starting point to look at. It compares the features side by side between StudioX and Studio. The bottom line is StudioX is centered around automating Office, Excel, Outlook, working with files, and automating user interfaces for attended automation only. StudioX only understands very simple types, strings, and numbers, so using activities that require storing information in variables of complex types like a dictionary is not supported. And other developer-focused concepts like error handling, try-catch, debugging, variables, and data types have been hidden away as well. Here's another summary view of what StudioX brings specifically and characteristics of StudioX usage that can help guide your customer in deciding when to use StudioX. Like I mentioned earlier, if a system developer starts automating something using StudioX and hits a roadblock that can better be resolved with Studio, it's possible to switch to using Studio to continue the development. Anything created in StudioX, user can switch back and forth between the StudioX and Studio profiles, but if the workflow is created in Studio, then it cannot be opened with StudioX. So the key takeaway is when giving customers guidance on StudioX usage, know that there's flexibility there as long as their commercial contract allows that, because there are different types of licenses. Before we get to questions, I'd like to leave you with this. I'm not sure if you guys have watched the classic Terminator movie, but I'd just like to wrap up by saying that governance is probably the one major area of concern from customers when considering adopting a system development model, as you've probably seen too. Just like in a movie, the deep fear that a monster robot will be created that will be better and more powerful than humans, uncontrollable and destructive, taking over the world, whether it be caused by malicious attempts or just by business user developers who simply didn't know what they were doing and created a monster by mistake. So by presenting a strong and robust governance framework that our products have made possible, it would really help with adoption and open customers' eyes to the possibilities while still remaining safe and secure. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Let me check. Okay.
Hey Jenny, it's Andrew.
Do you know, like, if customer purchase Studio license, I would assume that they could also use it as StudioX. But if they purchase StudioX, they could only use Studio with StudioX profile. Do we have a way to enforce it? Because my understanding, this profile switch could be done from the Studio interface.
Yeah, actually, so the way to enforce it is through the license key. If they only purchase StudioX and not Studio, they will be given a license key that is specific to StudioX, and when they activate, they will not have a choice to select profiles. It will just be StudioX automatically. But if they get a Studio license key, then they can choose between the two profiles. But with StudioX license key, it's automatically StudioX only.
Got it. Thank you.
And those licensing is through the orchestrator. You will have a new robot type called StudioX.
Right.
Jenny, this is
Any other
amazing. This is such a great presentation. I actually need access to these slides right away for a customer. How can we get to them?
Oh, yeah, I'll share these slides after Priscilla can share it out with the recording.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Any other thoughts or comments?
Hey, Jenny, I'd echo that. I think this is really useful and very relevant for customers now.
Visit us at uipath.com to learn more.